And welcome once again to the Only You, Dr. Tino over there in his office, and I am hiding out at home because I'm feeling a little under the weather. And why am I feeling under the weather? I haven't slept very well for a couple days, and that's actually going to segue nicely into our topic here because my lack of sleep has been affecting my physical health. But today we're going to talk about how the lack of sleep affects your mental health. What about that, doctor? Why is sleep so important?
Well, welcome everybody. We're going to take a little break from talking about parenting so you all can regroup and we'll get back to it down the road. But we're going to stay with sleep today. We're going to talk about the relationship between sleep and mental health. And I think I mean, straightforward answer your question, I can look at it very scientifically or I can look at it very concretely. But the reality is that if nature or God or whatever you believe gave you something you're going to do a third of your life, it's got to be tremendously important. So it doesn't matter how you slice it, right? Sleep is essential. Let me tell you some numbers and some statistics. Uh, you can live longer without food as long as you have fluids than without sleep.
Like
If you
literally, you would die.
Yes,
Hmm.
if I keep you awake long enough, you'll die.
Wow.
Right? So it's an essential function of the body of restoration of the brain, restoration of our ability to the brain to function adequately. So it's like giving a break to the computer, and in the background, the computer is kind of cleaning up processes, right? I mean, our brain is so magical, is so advanced, is so uh, misunderstood that he's got his own mechanisms of restoring, right? And his sleep is probably one of the primary ones. So if you're not spending a third of your life sleeping, something is not right. So we have to stay focused on that.
And I mean, it seems that nobody seems to get consistent sleep. I know I make it a huge priority in my life. So when it is a little off, it's kind of funky. But we hear about it all the time. There's products for staying awake, and even a lot of products for sleeping better, even though you may not be sleeping long enough. All sorts of business associated with that. Why is that such a big thing? Are we becoming more aware of it, or is it simply a marketing thing?
Well, you see, we can look at it in terms of history and where we are now. We can look at development and adaptation in terms of the impact of artificial light in our sleep cycles. So if you look at life prior to the Industrial Revolution in the mid to late 1700s, prior to that, we didn't have much of a need to work more than our light hours, right? And the artificial light we had in those times was not as intense as what we have created, right? So nature kind of guides us into our sleep. We're supposed to sleep when the sun goes down and get out when the sun goes up. Excuse me. And we have to be awake during the light hours. So basically, we are diurnal animals. We're not nocturnal animals. Dogs are nocturnal animals, actually. We have domesticated them and changed their cycles as part of the domestication, but they're like wolves. Wolves sleep during the day and they sleep during the day and they hunt at night, right? So in our case, we're the opposite. So we had to follow the sun. Back into the Industrial Revolution, when we decided to create artificial light and machinery and things of that sort, we started pushing the limits of wakefulness, meaning that if we stay awake longer, then we produce more, so we have more widgets to sell, right? So take it from the mid late 1700s till today, and that just exploded, right? So I mean, actually, in the early 1900s, there was a lot of revolution in terms of, wait a minute, we're killing people by working them to death. We're not paying them enough. And actually, you can trace the development of unions back to those
Mhm.
times, right? With the big fights in the 20s, 30s, um, and so on. So there's got to be a balance between nowadays between production and sleep. You can see it even with us physicians. I remember that's changed somewhat, but back in the day, We used to work 120 hours a week. We used to work 36-hour shifts, right? So you'll get out of the emergency room and try to drive home, and you were as impaired as if you were drunk, right? And that's been studied. So the number of accidents that happen after people have worked long hours without sleep increases dramatically. So insurance companies know all that data fairly well. But when it comes to emotions, there is a relation between sleep and regulation of emotions, right? In particular, aggressiveness, anxiety, and depression.
Hmm.
So, it's kind of like a two-way street. The lack of sleep may precipitate those problems, or if you have those problems genetically, the compensation usually starts with not sleeping, right? So, one of the most sensitive ways of measuring your mental state is to look at what's happening with your sleep. If you start getting a sleep deprived, you may get irritated, you may get sleepy, you may get fatigued. But if you are depressed as a result of an illness, it's going to affect your sleep too. Right? You're either going to sleep too much or you're going to sleep too little. So, the sleep is also essential to be able to keep your body healthy, right? People who are sleep deprived tend to have more inflammatory processes going on because it's stressful. So the body in general, your muscles, your organs require sleep to restore, right? So we have kind of pushed the limits of our adaptation by having too much light, requiring too much production. Now with the internet and with media equipment, we have a lot of light in front of us for a lot of hours, right? And I was actually listening to the news today, medical news about a new study that was done in Europe by the European Cardiology Association, looking at heart attacks in relation to what time you go to sleep, right?
Hmm.
And what they found is that people who go to sleep between 10 o'clock at night and 11 o'clock at night have a lot less heart attacks. I mean, I can't explain to you why that is happening, but those are findings, right?
Hmm.
So, in order to maintain your health, is not only how much you sleep, but sleeping at certain times. It usually has to be at night. Daytime sleep is not a substitute for night sleeping.
So you can never make up that quote unquote sleep debt through napping.
No, I mean, people who work graveyard shifts, I go to work at 11 o'clock, get up at 7 in the morning. They are chronically fatigued. They're going to
Hmm.
have difficulty. And it doesn't happen to everybody, but it's totally abnormal. If you talk to them and they say, well, I get home, I go to sleep at 9 o'clock in the morning. I try to get up by 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they will tell you they're not feeling rested,
Hmm.
right? Because our body's circadian rhythm follows the sun. Now, one of the best examples to looking at how lack of sun affects emotions is the sleep deprivation you get when you go to places where there's no sun, the poles, the North Pole, Alaska, right? Where people in the summer don't have any nights,
Hmm.
and in the winters don't have any days. And they develop what is called seasonal depressive disorders, right? And it's purely the result of lack of light, natural light, and actually is treated by exposing people to certain lamps that mimic natural
Hmm.
light, right?
So if sleep is so important physiologically for our bodies, but also for our minds, what is the optimal amount of sleep? I've known people who sleep 12 hours a day and are functional. And I've also met those very rare people who can sleep 4 hours a day and are very functional. Where does it really end? What is the actual number, especially if it's tied to the sun? I've spent time, as you know, down near the equator. You got 12-hour days, 12-hour nights,
Yes,
and that's a lot of dark.
yes. We know by looking at studies um, in populations that don't have exposure to artificial light. There's still some islands in the South Pacific where they live, or in the Amazon where they actually live in very natural ways, right? And you look at them because that biologically that's the best way to measure how do these people sleep. And invariably they all sleep nights, right? And the normal sleep for an adult is between 6.5 to 9 hours, right?
Mm,
So you can consider that. Some people will say 7 to 9 hours. That's what the Center for Disease Control will tell you, but it's actually like 6.5 to 8.5, just to round it up so you don't make it too complicated, right? However, sleep changes with age.
mm,
Newborns sleep 16 hours a day, right? And then you get into your adulthood, but actually being an adult, biologically speaking, means it's around 25, not 18. There's nothing magical about 18. Actually, teenagers still sleep a lot, especially boys, right? But once you get to 25 to probably 60, 65, you get into the average, right? The 6.5, 8.5 hours per night. And then once you get past 65, you actually need less sleep,
mm,
right? So sleeping 5.5 to 6.5 hours at that age is adequate, right? Um, but again, there are a lot of factors that impact the quality of the sleep. So one is the time of sleep, the other one is the quality of the sleep. And one of the big complications, if, let's say we remove time, we remove light exposure, there are things that wake you up at night a lot, right? So what is it? The most common is sleep apnea,
mm,
right? When people actually stop breathing a certain number of times per hour, and it's considered that anything probably about 10 episodes per hour, it will consider moderate sleep apnea. 15. I mean, I used to do sleep medicine. I used to see patients who stop breathing 30 times an hour. So if you wake up 30 times an hour for a couple of minutes, right, without even knowing it, because you literally stop breathing, and then you snore because your brain tells your lungs try harder, right? So you get obstructed, stop breathing, a minute, 30 seconds, oxygen levels go down, and then your brain tells the lungs breathe, right? Sends a signal. You breathe harder, and then you pull a lot of air in, and then your self palate vibrates. That's your snoring, right?
mm,
So snoring can be an indication, right, of sleep apnea. Not always, though. Not everybody who snores have sleep apnea. But if you have a partner that sleeps with you, they'll tell you you stop breathing and then you suddenly take this deep breath. Well, think about that happening 30 times an hour and your oxygen level going down, right, from 95 to 87, 30 times an hour for 8 hours. That's a lot of lack of oxygen to your brain. So, what happens when that accumulates over years is that you develop cognitive problems, difficulty concentrating, chronic fatigue, difficulty problem solving. So, that is why it's so important to recognize. And we're falling into the mistake of thinking that only people who are overweight get sleep apnea. It really has not much to do with weight. Well, he does has to do with weight too, but it has a lot to do with how your jaw is built and how small is the space between your tongue and the back of your throat. So if it's too narrow, then the tongue is going to block it, right? So what is the problem with that? Well, one is that you're chronically fatigued, even though you think you sleep enough hours. And the second problem is that if it happens for years, eventually you're going to develop high blood pressure and you're going to develop cardiac problems,
mm,
right? So, in general, if you have a sleep apnea, the likelihood of your longevity being reduced is very high. There's actually a big study that was done in Wisconsin called the Wisconsin cohort study. It was done for about 20 years following people with sleep apnea. And they found that people who have sleep apnea, especially moderate to severe, reduces their longevity by about 10 years.
wow.
So it's a serious problem. So we get into the issue of how much we sleep, and then we get into the issue of how well we sleep, right? And those have to go hand in hand. So I always recommend to people that if they snore a lot, if they have high blood pressure, if they're overweight, if they have difficulty with snoring, to go and talk to your family doctor and bring up the issue. I mean, people with diabetes, for example, in my experience, people with diabetes, because of neurological issues, I would say about 75% of them have sleep apnea,
Hmm.
and they never get treated, right? So we need to look more comprehensively at this.
So is snoring the main thing to look for, or the other things? Because I know personally, I did not know I had sleep apnea until I got tested. My case evidently was incredibly severe. My doctor said she had never seen anything like it, and I was put on one of the CPAP machines, and it has definitely changed my life for sure. But I never knew. Other than I just felt, you wake up in the morning, you're tired. That's just how life's supposed to be, and you snore a little bit. So, what are the other signals that someone could see, or the symptoms that might see for someone out there listening, saying, "Okay, I snore, but do I really have sleep apnea? I wake up a little tired." Well, what are they looking for in particular?
But what you're looking for is a number of things. One is listen to your partner and don't get defensive, right? When your partner tells you you have sleep apnea or you snore too much and you keep waking me up, that is a red flag, right? You shouldn't try to say, well, you snore too, right? And you keep me awake, blah blah blah. I mean, it shouldn't be perceived as a criticism, right? And to understand that serious snoring with sleep apnea can create pretty serious problems in the relationship, right? Not only because you're fatigued every day, because you're waking up your partner and you actually indirectly affecting your partner, right? So that is one thing to look for. The second is if you're overweight, if you have high blood pressure, you have diabetes. And I have to tell you, my experience is so common. Snoring is so common that we don't think as physicians to look into it.
Mm,
It's not one of those things that you go into the family doctor and they do a screening, right? Like they screen you for depression or anxiety and high blood pressure and diabetes. I think that everybody should be screened for sleep apnea,
mm,
right? Because there's a solution to it. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, the solution requires discipline from the patient, right? You have to lose weight, you have to wear your machine. I have sleep apnea. I wear a CPAP machine, and I used to do sleep medicine. I've been doing it for years, right? And I have to tell you that the quality of life of my wife has improved significantly since, right? So we have to value the measurement of our sleep. We have to value the quality of our sleep. We have to be responsible and looking for it. We getting into this routine now that somebody has to identify what we have,
mm,
right? That if I go to the doctor should be recognizing my problem. Well, the doctor is not going to recognize your problem if you don't tell him what you're dealing with, right? And in general, some of the symptoms of sleep apnea are very similar to the symptoms of depression, right? You don't sleep well, you're chronically fatigued, you're irritated, right? You have trouble concentrating, you have changes in your appetite. So I always, excuse me, I always tell my students and family doctors when I talk to them, listen, if you have somebody that you suspect is having depression, think of sleep apnea too,
mm,
because you can have more than one thing, right? I mean, you can ride a bicycle and have acne. You don't have to have just one thing. Okay, so it's important to recognize that um, we have to open our minds and to understand that we're treating a person, not an illness. We have gotten so narrow in medicine that we think of the patient as diabetes, hypertension, and we have to take a step back and take a look at the person and say, what is happening to your life, right? How are these things affecting you? You know, what is the fatigue doing to you? Is it, are you having trouble working? Are you having difficulty relating to people? Are you isolating? And so there's an interaction of what happens with us biologically and psychologically in our social environment. Actually, at the end of the day, when we treat these problems, right? When we try to help people with these problems, the way we should be measuring, okay, the patient getting better is not the absence of the symptoms, but the functionality.
mm.
I mean, actually, patients take a long time to recognize that the symptoms have gone down, but they can recognize, I'm not as irritated. My wife tells me that I'm easier to be with. I'm spending more time not procrastinating and paying attention to my kids. I am doing better at work. My performance is better. I'm doing more things, right? So I always have to say, listen to the people around you and don't feel judged or criticized, right? Because we're very sensitive to comments we get from other people. And I think that sometimes they're better judges of how we're functioning than ourselves.
Hmm. It seems that sleep being so important, it's a crux issue because it's going to affect everything else, whether you have a mental health issue or a physical issue. If your body can't recover, can't heal itself, it's not going to be better. You mentioned the times that we sleep. You mentioned the quality of the sleep. You mentioned sleep apnea in particular, but are there other sleep disorders that people are not really aware of?
Yeah, I mean, the whole area of sleep medicine is really fascinating. There are all kinds of different issues. Some that are more common to children, like sleep terrors. The kid wakes up in a panic, and is like something terrible is happening, and then they calm down. And all of these are biologically based disorders, but there are also issues of people that have their circadian rhythms kind of twisted, right? So there are people that have disorders that have to do with this sleep cycle being pushed forward or being pushed backwards. Uh, and I think that there are, just like we do with physical therapy, that people have to train themselves to regain strength and a muscle. The
Mhm.
same thing happens with sleep disorders. You have to get into a program of relearning certain steps and take some ownership of your sleep, right? Not in terms that something that is supposed to happen, but that you can contribute to make it happen better. So it's a partnership between nature and you, right? So if you recognize that um, you're not sleepy, or that you're having difficulty getting to sleep, don't jump into pills right away, right? There are practical things you can do. There are actually therapists or specialists on cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and they teach you techniques into the things that you have to do to have a healthy sleep. I always recommend that as a first step. Um, Medications for sleep are kind of a slippery slope because um, we're actually artificially trying to get you to sleep. Sometimes, I mean, we have medications that are non-addictive stimulants, like modafinil, that we use in patients with narcolepsy. That when the circadian rhythm is backwards, we help people be more awake during the daytime,
Hmm.
not necessarily putting them to sleep. So that we have better tools, but I think that we need to try natural tools first, right? A lot of people are getting into using melatonin, which is a natural substance that is actually activated by the sun going down. Melatonin increases. That's a natural signal to our brain that we should start going to sleep. Sometimes we can take melatonin to help us get to sleep. I do think that people tend to take it as a sleeping pill, saying I take melatonin, I should get to sleep, and it shouldn't be that way. We should follow the natural cycle of sleep. So we actually should take the melatonin uh, probably an hour, hour and a half before we're going to go to sleep.
Hmm.
Right now, some people get a placebo effect from melatonin that makes you very sleepy very quickly. That I don't necessarily think that's the intended effect of melatonin. uh, so if you get very sleepy when you take it, fine, take it when you go to sleep. But in general, it's a naturally occurring substance that should be increasing as the sun goes down.
And what about people using other pharmaceuticals like Benadryl, things like that make them sleepy? Is that a positive, or is that really kind of a dangerous thing to do?
You see, most over-the-counter sleeping medications are antihistaminics. It's either Benadryl or hydroxyzine, one or the other. Uh, they can be helpful as needed, not use them all the time, recognizing that they do have some side effects, right? They increase your appetite, they give you blurred vision, dry mouth, they can make you constipated. So there's some drawbacks of taking those medications. So there's nothing wrong to do it sporadically if you need to, right? But I don't think that we should use them as the treatment of your insomnia. The treatment of the insomnia is actually changing a lot of habits, and sometimes requires that you see a therapist, and then requires that you get to see a sleep specialist. There's certain things that you have to do before you go to sleep. Right? Don't eat too late. Okay, don't get into bed if you're not sleepy. Right. Uh, I mean, do something else, but don't do it in bed. Don't watch TV in bed. You know, sit down in a chair or a sofa and read something or do whatever. Once you start getting sleepy, go to bed. Because it's very frustrating. People goes to bed hoping that something magical is going to happen and they're going to get sleepy, and that's very frustrating, right? So you have to keep yourself active until you feel sleepy, right? Sometimes there's some techniques we call paradoxical intention, which is to train people to try to stay awake, right? And instead
Mm.
of trying to go into sleep, because then you're forcing your body, you're fighting your body natural tendency toward going to sleep. So by trying to stay awake, you're going to get more sleepy.
Hmm.
If that makes
Interesting.
any sense, right? Because we basically sleep is the balance of two forces, the wakefulness force and the sleepiness force, right? The sleepiness force usually starts in the late afternoon. The wakefulness force starts very early in the morning, right? 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, the changes start to happen. So we want to make sure that we have those two efforts balanced, right? It's very difficult if you're asleep to try to be paradoxical and say, I'm going to try to go to sleep now, right? But if you're awake, you can say, I'm going to try to stay awake. And by trying to stay awake, it forces you to go to sleep.
Hmm, interesting. I know that when I was working with some of the special folks back in the day,
Mm.
they took sleep very, very seriously. In fact, in the project I was associated with, all of the guys we were training had sleep monitors. And if they didn't get a certain amount of sleep, they were not allowed to do certain activities the next day because of the level of danger, even drive and certain other things. We kept them away, let them recover. Um, Other than sleep hygiene and being at least aware of the different things that could be affecting your sleep, what other remedies are there? What other things that you can get, advice you can give to somebody concerning their sleep?
Well, I think that it is terribly important that people value their sleep, right?
Mm,
We tend to look at sleep as something that happens to us, and we are participants in the process of going to sleep. We have to have ownership of our sleep, and we have to value it, right? So we should try to avoid anything that is going to interfere with it. Now, sometimes we overdo it, right? You drink too much alcohol. Alcohol is terrible for sleep, even though it's a sleeper in itself. The quality of the sleep when you're intoxicated with alcohol is pretty bad,
mm,
right? So it's not advisable, right, to drink too much. So people who have excessive drinking will have problem with sleep. I will have to tell people, please don't use drugs, right? If you use drugs that tend to be stimulants like cocaine and amphetamines, well, obviously you're not going to sleep. You're going to keep your brain artificially awake. And not unusually, what we see in those patients after they've been using for a while, psychosis, right? Paranoia. Somebody's following them. Somebody wants to kill them, right? You're getting to serious psychiatric complications. And to remember that uh, if you don't sleep well, you're going to have a nervous breakdown.
mm.
I mean, just think about it. What is one of the most, I mean, through history, one of the most common forms of torture is keeping you awake.
They wake up. It's
Okay.
also one of the most effective.
Yeah. And not only that, I mean, if you look at in the old days, how did they domesticated wild horses? By keeping them awake. Don't let them sleep. Eventually, they'll get fatigued and docile, right? So this is not just for humans, this is for animals too,
Mm.
right? And animals won't let you interfere with their sleep. So why do we?
Hmm. Yeah, we give it
Right?
away. We trade it for other things, for a couple more hours of work, maybe some more TV
Exactly.
time.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think that the best message for people is treasure your sleep. If you can't sleep well, seek professional help. Don't necessarily jump into medications right away. Use sleep hygiene. Don't over exercise before you go to bed. Try not to get into bed if you're not tired. you know, and to recognize that bed is only good for two things, right? Sleep and intimacy, and that's it. You shouldn't be doing anything else in bed. Okay.
Well, once again, appreciate the time. We always start these talks like we'll just discuss briefly about a subject, and by the time we're done, you realize, boy, we could do about 5 shows on this because of how in depth it can really be. Um,
Yeah.
much,
And again, I think it's important that people start sending their questions and asking us more if they have any doubts or concerns, some guidance in terms of their specific situation, right?
yeah, because again, the name of the show is The Only You, and we literally mean that to the audience. It is about you. We want to answer your questions and do what we can to support you. Well, once again, thank you for the last half hour of your life, and hopefully we'll see you again next week.
Thank you. You have a good night. Get yourself to sleep, okay?
I will. Thank you.
Okay.